It was supposed to be a simple overnight train ride. Just a few hours through quiet countryside, arriving early the next morning. I'd done this route dozens of times, but something about that particular night felt off from the beginning. The air was heavy and still, the kind of night where even the wind seemed reluctant to move. I shrugged off the unease, chalking it up to nerves from a long week. The train was nearly empty, with only a few scattered passengers. I found a window seat in one of the quieter cars and settled in for the ride. The rhythmic clack of the train on the tracks was soothing at first, and I leaned my head against the window, watching the darkness rush by. Every now and then, the headlights would catch the fleeting silhouette of a tree or a sign, but mostly it was just blackness outside, a void. About an hour into the journey, I noticed something strange. The train seemed to be slowing down, but there were no stops scheduled for another 2 hours. I looked around, and the other passengers seemed oblivious, lost in their own worlds with headphones or books. The train slowed to a crawl, and then, with a soft screech of the brakes, it stopped completely. I glanced out the window, but there was nothing out there, no station, no lights, just endless darkness. The train sat in silence for a few long minutes. I waited for an announcement from the conductor, but none came. The quiet became suffocating, and that's when I heard it, faint, barely audible at first, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps. They were coming from the car ahead of mine, slow, deliberate, and strangely heavy, as if someone were dragging their feet. I leaned into the aisle, peering toward the front of the train, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and with each step, my heartbeat seemed to quicken. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A woman sitting across from me looked up from her book, her brow furrowed. Another passenger, a man a few rows back, took off his headphones and looked around. We exchanged uneasy glances, the unspoken question hanging in the air: who was walking through the train at this hour? The footsteps paused, and for a moment, the train was dead silent again. Then, the lights flickered, just once, but long enough for my stomach to drop. When they came back on, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway at the far end of the car. It was tall, and naturally so, with broad shoulders and a dark, featureless face. My breath caught in my throat as the figure began to move toward us, slowly, methodically. It didn't make a sound, but the air seemed to grow colder with each step it took. The woman across from me gasped, and the man behind me muttered something under his breath. The figure moved closer, its presence oppressive and overwhelming. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even though every instinct screamed at me to look away, to hide, to do anything but watch as it approached. Just as it reached the middle of the car, the train lurched forward with a sudden jolt. The lights flickered again, and when they stabilized, the figure was gone. The footsteps had stopped, and the train was moving again, as if nothing had happened. For a long moment, no one spoke. We were all staring at the spot where the figure had been, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were clammy. Finally, the woman across from me broke the silence. Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. The man behind me let out a shaky breath and stood up, walking to the front of the car. He peeked into the next car and shook his head. "There's no one there," he said. Nothing. The rest of the ride was tense and silent. No one spoke, and no one dared to move from their seats. We all sat there, eyes wide, listening for the sound of footsteps that never came again. The train rolled through the night, and eventually, we reached our destination. When we got off the train, the conductor stood by the door, smiling and welcoming passengers to the station as if nothing strange had occurred. I wanted to ask him if he'd seen anything, if he knew what had happened, but the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't shake the feeling that asking would somehow make it real, and I didn't want it to be real. As I walked through the station and out into the early morning air, I looked back at the train. It stood there, quiet and unassuming, as if it hadn't just transported us through a nightmare. I never took that route again. Some things are better left unexplored, and some mysteries are best left unsolved. It was a dreary evening when I boarded the last train from my hometown. I had been visiting family for the holidays and was eager to return to the city. The train was almost empty, save for a few scattered passengers. I took a window seat and settled in, planning to catch up on some reading. The train began its journey, and the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks soon lulled me into a sense of calm. About an hour into the trip, the train entered a particularly remote stretch of track, flanked by dense woods. The fog outside thickened, and visibility dropped. I glanced around the nearly deserted car and noticed an elderly woman sitting across from me, her face obscured by the shadows of her wide-brimmed hat. She hadn't moved since I boarded, and her silence was unsettling. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to strike up a conversation. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound friendly. "Quite a foggy night, isn't it?" The woman didn't respond. I gave her a polite smile and returned to my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I looked up again and noticed that her gaze was fixed directly on me, her eyes hidden beneath the brim of her hat. I felt a chill run down my spine. Minutes passed, and the train seemed to slow down. The usual comforting hum of the engine was replaced by an unsettling silence. The fog outside had turned the world into a ghostly blur. I glanced around the car and noticed that the other passengers were gone. The car was now completely empty. I stood up, my heart pounding, and made my way to the next car to see if anyone else was there. As I walked down the dimly lit aisle, I saw that the next car was also empty. And an uneasy feeling settled over me. I returned to my seat, but the elderly woman was no longer there. Her absence was strangely ominous. I sat back down and tried to calm myself. Maybe the woman had just gone to the restroom or another car. I glanced at my watch and realized we had been stationary for longer than usual. The train wasn't moving, and there was no announcement from the conductor. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the car. The silence was oppressive, and the occasional creak of the train seemed unnaturally loud. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. The car was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone and turned on its flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. I scanned the car, trying to find any sign of movement. Then, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It seemed to come from the direction of the empty seats, but I couldn't make out any words. The whisper grew louder, filling the car with a disembodied murmur. My pulse raced, and I gripped my phone tightly. I stood up and cautiously made my way to the front of the car, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. As I reached the door, the lights flickered back on, and the train jolted forward, resuming its journey. The car was now filled with passengers once more, though none of them seemed to have noticed the eerie events. I returned to my seat, trying to convince myself it was all just a bad dream or a trick of the mind. The elderly woman was nowhere to be seen, and the other passengers were chatting and reading, seemingly oblivious to the strange occurrences. When the train finally reached my destination, I disembarked, feeling a profound sense of relief. The fog had lifted, and the night air was crisp and clear. I glanced back at the train, but it had already departed, disappearing into the distance. I never did find out what happened on that train ride. The elderly woman, the sudden silence, and the inexplicable whispers remained a mystery. Although I arrived safely and nothing truly sinister occurred, the experience left me with an unsettling feeling. Sometimes, I wonder if the train carried more than just passengers that night, and if the fog and darkness were hiding something far more unsettling than I dared to imagine. I've always been a fan of nighttime train rides. There's something oddly comforting about the rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks and the gentle sway of the carriages. So when I had to travel late one evening to visit a friend in a distant town, I welcomed the opportunity. The train was nearly empty, which made finding a seat easy. I chose a spot in the middle of the car, where the overhead lights flickered intermittently. The journey started smoothly. I settled in with a book, and the train rolled through the dark countryside. The quiet was almost peaceful, occasionally broken by the distant hum of the engine or the soft rustle of passengers. After a while, I noticed the train slowing down and coming to a stop at a small, seemingly deserted station. Curiosity piqued. I peered out the window, but the fog was so thick that I could barely see the platform. The train's lights barely penetrated the mist, creating a ghostly glow around the station. The stop seemed unusually prolonged, and the silence outside was profound, an eerie contrast to the usual sounds of a bustling station. After several minutes, the train jolted forward again, continuing its journey. I returned to my book, trying to ignore the unsettling atmosphere. It was then that I noticed a new passenger had entered the car while we were stopped. They were dressed in a long, dark coat and hat, their face hidden in the shadows. They chose a seat a few rows in front of me and remained perfectly still. The figure's stillness struck me as strange. In my peripheral vision, I could occasionally catch glimpses of the person's hat, but their face was obscured. I tried to focus on my book, but an uneasy feeling crept over me. The air seemed to grow colder, and the occasional flicker of the lights made the shadows dance oddly around the car. I was on edge, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I kept glancing up from my book, and each time I did, the figure was still in the same position, their head slightly bowed. No one else seemed to pay them any attention. The train continued its journey, the landscape outside disappearing into the dense fog. Suddenly, the lights in the car went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting, and I could hear muffled gasps from other passengers. My flashlight, which I always keep in my bag for such emergencies, came to my rescue. I turned it on and scanned the car. The new passenger was still there, their form barely visible in the dim beam of my light. After what felt like an eternity, the lights flickered back on. I looked toward where the figure had been, but the seat was empty. The figure had vanished. I felt a chill run down my spine, and the uneasy feeling intensified. I glanced around the car, but everyone else seemed oblivious to the disappearance. As the train continued, I decided to move to a different car. I walked down the aisle, and as I passed the seat where the figure had been, I noticed something odd, a faint, but distinct, imprint in the seat cushion as if someone had been sitting there for a long time. I quickened my pace, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and the mysterious figure. I eventually reached a car where other passengers were gathered, chatting and laughing. Their presence was reassuring, and I finally began to relax. I never saw the dark figure again, nor did anyone else mention anything unusual. When the train arrived at my destination, I was relieved to step onto solid ground. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been very wrong on that train ride, but no one else seemed to have noticed anything out of the ordinary. I tried to rationalize the experience, telling myself it was just a trick of the light and my overactive imagination. Years later, I looked up reports about the train line and found nothing unusual. But to this day, I can't forget the unsettling presence of the dark figure and the strange events of that night. It remains a chilling reminder of how easily the ordinary can become eerie and how sometimes the scariest experiences are the ones we can't fully explain. It was a late evening when I boarded the night train from my small town to the city. I'd been working late and missed the last bus, so I had no choice but to take the train. The train station was eerily quiet, and a fog had settled over the tracks, giving everything an almost otherworldly sheen. As I boarded the train, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The train was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers. I found my seat in an almost deserted car and settled in. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks was oddly soothing, and I tried to relax as we pulled out of the station. As the train progressed, I noticed something peculiar. The lights in our car flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. It was a minor annoyance at first, but as the flickering grew more frequent, it became unsettling. I glanced around the car, but no one else seemed to react to the malfunctioning lights. After a while, the flickering stopped, and the lights steadied. I was starting to relax again when I noticed a man sitting across from me who hadn't been there before. He was dressed in a tattered overcoat and had an unkempt appearance, his face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. He seemed to be studying me intently, though I couldn't see his eyes. I tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the passing scenery outside. The train had left the city lights behind, and the view was now just a blur of dark shapes and shadows. The car was growing colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The man's presence was unnerving, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but the constant sense of being watched made it difficult to concentrate. I glanced up occasionally, but the man remained still and silent. Then, without warning, the lights went out completely. The car was plunged into darkness, and the train's motion seemed to stutter. There were muffled sounds of surprise and concern from other passengers, and I could hear whispers and shuffling. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim, red glow that barely illuminated the interior. I felt a growing sense of panic. The train had slowed to a crawl, and the air was filled with a low, mechanical hum. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to see better. The beam of light cut through the dimness, revealing the man across from me, now standing and moving towards me with deliberate slowness. "Is everything okay?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The other passengers were still murmuring, and some were attempting to use their phones for light. The man didn't respond. He continued to approach, his movements oddly fluid and deliberate. As he came closer, I noticed a strange, unsettling detail. His face was obscured, But there was something about his presence that felt deeply wrong. The train came to a complete stop, and the lights flickered back on. The man abruptly stopped moving, his posture remaining still and rigid. The lights were back to their normal state, and the air warmed up again. It was as if nothing had happened. The man was gone. I looked around, but there was no sign of him. The car was now fully lit, and the other passengers were looking around, confused and disoriented but otherwise unharmed. I glanced down the aisle and saw that the car was now populated with people who hadn't been there before. "Are you all right?" one of the new passengers asked me, their concern genuine. "I think so," I replied, still shaken. "Did you see a man in a tattered coat?" The passengers shook their head, puzzled. "No, I didn't see anyone like that." We were soon informed that the train had experienced a minor technical issue, and everything was now resolved. The train resumed its journey, and the rest of the trip passed without incident. I kept my eyes peeled, but the mysterious man never reappeared. When I finally reached my destination, I was relieved to step off the train and into the bustling city. The experience had left me unsettled, and I couldn't help but wonder if it had all been a figment of my imagination. To this day, I'm not sure what happened that night. The flickering lights, the man in the tattered coat, and the sudden stop all felt too real to dismiss as mere coincidence. I've traveled by train many times since, but I always keep an eye out, hoping never to encounter that unsettling presence again. I had always enjoyed late-night train rides. They offered a kind of tranquil solitude that was rare in my busy life. On this particular evening, I boarded the last train from the city to my hometown, looking forward to a quiet journey. The train was sparsely populated, with only a few passengers scattered throughout the carriages. I found a seat near the middle of the train, settled in with my book, and soon lost myself in its pages. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks was soothing, a sound I found oddly comforting. The train was dimly lit, the low lighting casting long shadows and creating a cozy, almost dreamlike atmosphere. About halfway through the journey, the train passed through a particularly dark stretch of track. The lights flickered briefly before going out entirely. For a moment, we were plunged into total darkness. There was a collective murmur of confusion among the passengers, but the darkness was short-lived. The lights came back on, though they were dimmer than before. I glanced around, noting that the other passengers seemed as unsettled as I was. The dim lighting made the interior look more foreboding, with shadows stretching and shifting in unsettling ways. I shook off my unease and returned to my book. A few minutes later, I noticed something strange. The passenger sitting across from me, an elderly woman with a cane, had gone silent. She had been chatting quietly with her companion before the lights went out, but now she was staring straight ahead, her face pale and her eyes wide. Her companion, a middle-aged man, was speaking to her but received no response. My curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at the elderly woman again. Her gaze was fixed on a point just beyond the train window. I followed her line of sight and saw nothing but the endless darkness outside. Suddenly, the train lurched, and the lights flickered once more. This time, they didn't return immediately. The darkness felt oppressive, almost tangible. I heard a series of muffled noises, whispers, perhaps, or the rustling of movement in the dark. My heart raced, and I tried to steady my breathing. Then, just as abruptly as it had gone out, the lighting returned, though the atmosphere in the carriage felt different. It was colder, and an inexplicable sense of dread hung in the air. The elderly woman's eyes were now closed, her head resting against the back of her seat as if she had fallen asleep. The man sitting with her appeared more agitated. He was looking around nervously, his face flushed. He leaned over to a nearby passenger and whispered something that I couldn't quite hear. The passenger nodded, looking equally uneasy. The train continued on its way, but the atmosphere in the carriage remained tense. I tried to focus on my book, but every creak and groan of the train seemed amplified, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. As the journey progressed, I noticed that the other passengers were acting strangely. Some whispered amongst themselves, while others stared out of the windows with expressions of worry. The train seemed to be moving slower, and the frequent stops in the middle of nowhere only added to the eerie feeling. Eventually, the train arrived at my station. The elderly woman and her companion were nowhere to be seen, and the remaining passengers quickly disembarked. I hurried off the train, my mind racing with the strange occurrences of the journey. I looked back at the train as it pulled away, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Back home, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I tried to rationalize the events of the night. Perhaps it was just a mechanical malfunction or a power issue that had affected the lighting. But the atmosphere in that carriage, the odd behavior of the passengers, and the inexplicable sense of dread left a lasting impression on me. In the days that followed, I did some research and discovered that there had been reports of similar disturbances on that route in the past, mysterious occurrences that defied explanation. The incidents were always brief and never seemed to have any lasting impact, but they left a mark on those who experienced them. While I never encountered anything directly threatening, the experience was enough to make me think twice about late-night train rides. There was something undeniably unsettling about that journey, a reminder that sometimes the things we can't explain are the ones that leave the deepest impressions. It was a quiet, foggy evening when my friends and I boarded the midnight train from an old station on the outskirts of town. The train was an antique, an old steam engine that had been refurbished for special scenic rides through the countryside. We were excited for the experience, eager to enjoy the nostalgic charm of the historic journey. The train was nearly empty when we boarded, with just a few other passengers scattered throughout the ornate, vintage cars. We settled into our seats, which were plush and upholstered in rich, dark fabrics. The soft, rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks combined with the occasional whistle of the engine created a soothing, almost hypnotic ambience. As the train departed, the landscape outside the windows was quickly swallowed by the dense fog rolling in from the fields. The dim, warm light inside the car contrasted sharply with the cold, gray mist outside, making it feel as though we were drifting through a world cut off from reality. Around midnight, as we were chatting and laughing about the ride, something peculiar happened. The train's lights flickered briefly, then dimmed. The warmth of the car seemed to recede, replaced by an unsettling chill. We exchanged nervous glances, but the train staff assured us it was nothing unusual, a minor glitch in the old lighting system. The train continued on its route, but the atmosphere grew increasingly eerie. Shadows seemed to shift and move just out of the corners of our eyes. Every now and then, we heard strange creaks and groans from the old train, though the sound of the wheels and engine covered most of it. It was then that I noticed a figure standing at the end of our car, just beyond the reach of the flickering light. The figure was barely visible, a dark silhouette against the foggy window. I blinked, and it was gone. I thought I might have been imagining things, but the unease among my friends was palpable. Did anyone else see that? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. See what? Jake replied, though his voice had a strained edge. Before anyone could respond, the train's lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the emergency lamps mounted along the walls. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the train's wheels on the tracks. We fumbled for our phones to use as flashlights. As the dim light from our screens flickered, we saw that the figure was now standing directly across the aisle from us, closer than before. It was a man dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. He wasn't there before, Emily said, her voice trembling. Is this part of the ride? We tried to approach the figure, but as we moved closer, he seemed to dissolve into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. The lights flickered back on, and the warmth returned to the car, but the atmosphere remained thick with tension. The rest of the ride was uneventful, though none of us could shake the feeling of being watched. The figure never reappeared, and the train arrived at our destination without further incident. As we disembarked, we couldn't help but feel relieved to be back in the open air, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the train. Back at home, I tried to research the train and its history. To my surprise, I found that the train had a reputation for strange occurrences. According to local lore, it was rumored to be haunted by the spirit of a former conductor who had vanished mysteriously decades ago. Passengers had reported sightings of a shadowy figure resembling the conductor, often accompanied by unexplained drops in temperature and electrical disturbances. Though we all made it off the train safely, the experience left us with an unsettling sense of unease. The shadowy figure and the inexplicable chill had been unnerving, a reminder that even in the seemingly mundane, there can be elements beyond our understanding. To this day, whenever I hear the distant sound of a train whistle, I remember that eerie ride through the fog and the ghostly figure that vanished into the shadows. It was a chilling reminder that sometimes, the things we think we left behind can come back to haunt us in the most unexpected ways.